750 years before the birth of Christ, riders appeared on the horizon of Eastern Europe carrying a weapon that would transform warfare forever. The Scythians, emerging from the vast steppes of Central Asia, brought with them not just horses and gold and terror, but a technological marvel that European warriors had never seen. A bow made not from a single piece of wood, but from layers of horn and sinew and timber, glued together with such precision that it could store more power in a weapon shorter than a man's arm than any European bow twice its size. This was the composite bow, and its arrival in Europe marked one of the great technological revolutions in military history. The story of how this weapon reached European soil and what it did when it got there is a tale of migration and invasion, of innovation clashing with tradition, and of how a single piece of technology can reshape the fate of civilizations. The Scythians themselves were a mystery to the settled peoples of Europe and the Near East. Ancient writers struggled to understand these nomadic warriors who lived not in cities but in wagons, who drank from the skulls of their enemies, who tattooed their bodies with elaborate animal designs, and who seemed to appear from nowhere like a storm across the grasslands. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, described them with a mixture of fascination and horror, noting that none who attacked them could escape, and none could catch them if they desired not to be found. But by the time Herodotus was recording their customs, the Scythians had already been reshaping Eastern European warfare for 2 centuries. The origins of the Scythians trace back to the steppes of southern Siberia and the Altai Mountains, where archaeological evidence from burial mounds called kurgans dates their distinctive culture to at least the 9th century BC. These were not primitive nomads struggling for survival. The grave goods recovered from Scythian tombs reveal a sophisticated society of skilled goldsmiths, master horsemen, and above all, expert archers. The famous golden Scythian treasures with their elaborate animal-style art show a people who understood metalworking at a level equal to any civilization of their time. But it was not gold that made the Scythians formidable. It was their mastery of mounted archery, and at the heart of that mastery was the composite bow. To understand why the composite bow represented such a revolutionary technology, we must first understand what European warriors were using before the Scythians arrived. In the Bronze and early Iron Ages of Europe, warfare centered on close combat with bronze and later iron swords, spears and axes. These were weapons of strength and courage, requiring men to meet face to face in battle. Bronze Age swords excavated from across Europe typically measured 60 to 80 centimeters in length. They were weapons for cutting and thrusting at arm's reach. Archery existed, certainly. Simple self-bows, carved from a single piece of wood, were known throughout Europe. But these bows had severe limitations. To generate enough power to be effective weapons, they needed to be tall, often taller than the man using them. A yew longbow, which would not appear in its developed form until much later, needed to be 6 feet long or more to store enough energy to penetrate armor or kill at distance. Such weapons were impractical on horseback and required considerable strength to draw. The Scythian bow was something entirely different. At roughly 120 centimeters when strung, about the length from a man's hip to his fingertips, it was shorter than any self-bow with comparable power. The secret lay in its composite construction. The core was wood, typically birch or larch, carefully selected for its grain and flexibility. But this wooden core was only the skeleton. On the belly of the bow, the side facing the archer, craftsmen glued strips of horn, usually from ibex or water buffalo. Horn has extraordinary compressive strength. When the bow is drawn, this horn layer compresses without shattering, storing tremendous energy. On the back of the bow, the side facing away from the archer, layers of sinew were applied, typically from the Achilles tendons or back tendons of deer or horses. Sinew, when properly prepared, has exceptional tensile strength. As the bow bends, this sinew layer stretches, storing even more energy than wood alone could manage. The construction process was an art form passed down through generations of master bowyers. The materials had to be gathered with care. The horn needed to be soaked and shaped, the sinew pounded and dried, the wood seasoned and carved. Once assembled with animal glue, the bow required months, sometimes up to 2 years, of drying in carefully controlled conditions. Too much moisture and the glue would weaken. Too much heat and the materials would crack. A completed Scythian bow represented hundreds of hours of skilled labour and intimate knowledge of materials science that Bronze Age Europeans had never developed. But the result was worth every moment of that labour. A Scythian bow with a draw weight of 45 to 55 kilograms could shoot an arrow over 500 metres. A Greek inscription from Olbia on the Black Sea records a shooting contest where a man named Anaxagoras, almost certainly using a Scythian bow, launched an arrow 521 metres, nearly a third of a mile. For perspective, most simple wooden bows of the period struggled to achieve effective range beyond 150 metres, but range was only part of the advantage. The recurve shape of the Scythian bow, with its tips curving away from the archer when unstrung, meant that when the bow was drawn, enormous energy was stored in the limbs. This energy was transferred to the arrow with exceptional efficiency, giving Scythian arrows both range and penetrating power. Archaeological evidence shows Scythian arrows, typically 70 to 80 centimetres long, tipped with bronze trilobate arrowheads designed for maximum penetration. These were not hunting arrows. They were weapons of war, engineered to punch through the leather and light bronze armour that European warriors wore. The Scythians began their migration westward from Central Asia during the 8th century BC. The reasons for this movement remain debated by historians. Climate change may have played a role, as the steppes experienced periods of cooling and drying that made grazing more difficult. Population pressure from other nomadic groups pushing from the east certainly contributed. Whatever the cause, waves of Scythian tribes moved west along the great corridor of the Eurasian steppe, displacing or absorbing earlier populations. By the 7th century BC, Scythian groups had crossed the Caucasus Mountains and established themselves in the Pontic steppe, the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea in what is now Ukraine and southern Russia. This was Eastern Europe's first encounter with the composite bow on a massive scale. The impact was immediate and profound. The Scythians did not come as traders or peaceful migrants. They came as conquerors, and their primary military tactics centred on mounted archery. A Scythian warrior, trained from childhood in both horsemanship and archery, could shoot his bow accurately while riding at full gallop. The stirrup had not yet been invented, but Scythian horsemen developed techniques for standing in their saddles or gripping their horses with their legs that allowed them to shoot in nearly any direction, including the famous Parthian shot, firing backwards over the horse's rump while retreating. The psychological impact on European warriors accustomed to face-to-face combat was devastating. Imagine being a Bronze Age warrior, armed with a spear and a sword, facing an enemy who refuses to close with you. Instead, mounted Scythians circle just out of reach, raining arrows from bows that can pierce your armour at ranges where you cannot even respond. You try to charge, but they wheel away, their horses fresh while yours tire. You try to retreat, but they follow, harassing with arrows that seem to come from every direction. Traditional European tactics of shield walls and close formation infantry were useless against an enemy who would not stand and fight. The Scythians had discovered the essence of mobile warfare, and the composite bow was the technology that made it possible. The archaeological record preserves evidence of this transformation. Scythian artifacts, particularly their distinctive arrowheads and elements of their characteristic animal-style art, begin appearing across Eastern Europe in the 7th century BC. Fortified settlements from this period show signs of violent destruction, and the burial practices of indigenous populations change, often incorporating Scythian elements. Some local groups were conquered and absorbed. Others became tributary peoples, paying the Scythians in grain and goods in exchange for protection or simply survival. Still others adopted Scythian military technology, acquiring composite bows and learning mounted archery and self-defense. But the Scythians were not content to dominate the Pontic steppe. In the 7th century BC, they pushed south across the Caucasus Mountains into West Asia, launching devastating raids into the kingdoms of Media and Assyria. Assyrian texts from the reign of King Esarhaddon, dating between 680 and 678 BC, provide the first written mentions of the Scythians in Near Eastern records. The Assyrians called them Mishkuza, and they regarded them with a mixture of respect and fear. The Scythians allied with the Manians against Assyria, and their mounted archers proved a formidable addition to Near Eastern warfare. These raids into West Asia brought the Scythians into contact with civilizations that already knew the composite bow. The Assyrians, Egyptians, and other Near Eastern powers had been using composite bows for centuries, primarily on chariots. But the Scythian innovation was mounting the bow on horseback and developing the tactics to use it effectively. Near Eastern armies had used composite bows as powerful ranged weapons, but typically in more static roles. The Scythians turned the composite bow into the centerpiece of a highly mobile military system that could strike anywhere, any time, with devastating effect. The Persians learned this lesson the hard way. In 513 BC, Darius I, the great king of the Achaemenid Empire, launched an invasion of Scythia. Darius commanded what was arguably the most powerful army in the world at that time, a force that had conquered from Egypt to India. He crossed the Bosphorus on a bridge of boats and marched north of the Danube into Scythian territory, expecting to bring these troublesome nomads to battle and crush them. The Scythians had no intention of fighting on Persian terms. They employed a strategy that would become known as scorched earth. As the Persian army advanced, the Scythians retreated, driving their herds before them, burning the grass, poisoning wells, and destroying anything that might sustain the invaders. Persian foraging parties were ambushed by mounted archers who struck without warning and vanished into the steppe. Darius's army, designed for set-piece battles and sieges, found itself chasing an enemy it could never catch, slowly bleeding from constant archery attacks, running low on supplies as winter approached. Herodotus preserves an exchange between Darius and the Scythian king Edanthusus. Darius sent a message demanding that the Scythians stand and fight or acknowledge him as their master. Edanthusus replied that the Scythians had no cities to defend and no cultivated land to protect. They were already home, the entire steppe was their territory, and they would fight only when and where they chose. The message was clear. Persian military might, based on heavy infantry and static tactics, was useless against an enemy who refused to engage except on their own terms. Darius eventually withdrew, his army battered and diminished, having accomplished nothing. The Scythian campaign became a legendary example of how mobility and superior ranged weapons could defeat even the largest and most powerful conventional army. The lessons of Scythian warfare spread throughout the ancient world. The Persians, after their humiliating failure against the Scythians, adopted the composite bow more widely in their own military. Images from the palace at Susa, Darius's capital, show Persian warriors with composite bows of clearly Scythian influence. During the Greek-Persian Wars, Greek hoplites encountered Persian mounted archers at battles like Plataea, where Herodotus records that Persian horsemen inflicted casualties across the Greek line with arrows, making it impossible for the Greeks to close with them. The Greeks themselves recognized the power of the bow. Scythian archers were regularly employed as mercenaries by Greek city-states, and Athens maintained a police force of Scythian bowmen. Greek art from the classical period frequently depicts Scythian archers, easily identifiable by their distinctive clothing, trousers, and pointed caps, carrying their characteristic composite bows. The goritos, the distinctive Scythian combined bowcase and quiver, became a status symbol in Greek culture. These leather cases, worn on the left hip with the opening facing rearward, protected the sensitive composite bow from moisture while allowing rapid access to both bow and arrows. Elaborate decorated goritoi, often covered in gold leaf with intricate metalwork, have been found in wealthy Greek tombs, including the tomb traditionally identified as belonging to Philip II of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great. The presence of such items in elite Macedonian burials demonstrates how thoroughly Scythian archery equipment had been adopted by Greek military aristocracy. Alexander the Great himself would face the descendants of the Scythians when he pushed his conquests into Central Asia. In 328 BC, at the Battle of Jaxartes River, Alexander fought against Saka nomads, eastern relatives of the Scythians, who employed the same composite bow and mounted archery tactics. It was one of Alexander's most difficult victories. Of 4,500 nomadic horsemen, only 800 were killed, but Alexander's own losses were severe enough that he wisely chose not to pursue the nomads into the depths of the steppe. Even Alexander, one of history's greatest military minds, recognized that conventional tactics and heavy infantry were poorly suited to fighting mobile horse archers in open terrain. But what of Europe itself, the territories west of the Black Sea? How did the composite bow spread into the Mediterranean world and beyond? The answer lies in the complex web of trade, warfare, and cultural exchange that characterized the ancient world. The Greeks, through their Black Sea colonies like Olbia, maintained constant contact with Scythian tribes. These colonies served as trading posts where Greek-manufactured goods, particularly wine and luxury items, were exchanged for Scythian grain, furs, and gold. Along with material goods, technology, and techniques travelled these trade routes. Greek craftsmen learned to make composite bows. Greek warriors learned Scythian archery techniques. The goritos and composite bow became part of the Greek military toolkit, particularly for cavalry and light infantry. The Romans, always quick to adopt useful military innovations, recognized the power of the composite bow when they encountered it among their enemies. The Parthians, who inherited the Scythian tradition of mounted archery, inflicted one of Rome's most humiliating defeats at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, where Roman legions were massacred by Parthian horse archers using composite bows. The lesson was learned. The Roman army incorporated auxiliary units of mounted archers, many recruited from peoples who had inherited the Scythian archery tradition. Archaeological evidence shows composite bows were manufactured even in distant Roman Britain, though the damp climate of northern Europe made composite bows less practical than they were in the dry climates of the steppe or Mediterranean. The construction techniques for composite bows spread slowly through Europe, transmitted through military contact, trade, and the movement of peoples. By the late Roman period, knowledge of composite bow construction had reached most of the Mediterranean world and beyond, but the bow never became dominant in Western Europe the way it had in the steppes. Several factors explain this. First, composite bows were extraordinarily time-consuming and expensive to make. A master bowyer might spend months creating a single bow, requiring rare materials including specific types of horn and sinew that were not readily available in all regions. A simple self-bow could be carved from a single piece of wood in a day and dried in a week, as scholar Adam Karpowicz has noted. For armies needing to equip thousands of men, self-bows were far more practical. Second, composite bows were sensitive to moisture. In the dry climates of the steppe, the Near East, and much of the Mediterranean, this was not a significant problem. But in the damp, rainy regions of northern and western Europe, composite bows could lose their power as the animal glue weakened. The Byzantine military manual known as the Strategikon, written in the 6th century AD, specifically advised cavalry to keep their composite bows in leather cases to protect them from moisture. European warriors living in regions with high rainfall generally preferred self-bows or, for crossbows, composite prods that could be better protected from the elements. Third, the composite bow required extensive training to use effectively. The Scythians, trained from childhood, developing the strength and technique to draw heavy bows and shoot accurately from horseback. This was a lifetime commitment to the art of archery. European military systems, particularly the Greek hoplite tradition, and later the Roman legionary system, focused on heavy infantry with spears and swords. Archery was often relegated to auxiliary troops or specialists, rather than being the centerpiece of military doctrine. The European military tradition valued close combat, personal courage in battle face-to-face with the enemy, and the discipline of tight infantry formations. The composite bow, weapon of the mobile skirmisher, fit poorly into this military culture. Yet the influence of the Scythian composite bow on European warfare cannot be overstated. The very concept of mobile warfare, of using superior range and mobility to defeat heavier, more numerous enemies, entered European military thinking through contact with the Scythians. The terror inspired by mounted archers influenced European tactics for centuries. The fear of being unable to close with an enemy who could kill from a distance, the helplessness of heavy infantry against mobile cavalry archers, these became enduring lessons of military history. Even as European military systems continued to emphasize close combat, they had to develop responses to mounted archery, from improved armor to combined arms tactics that could counter mobile enemies. The arrival of the Huns in Europe during the 4th century AD represented a second wave of composite bow technology hitting the continent. The Huns, like the Scythians before them, were steppe nomads who had perfected mounted archery. Their composite bows, longer and more powerful than earlier Scythian designs, with stiffened grips and ears created by adding bone or antler laths, represented an evolution of the basic Scythian template. The Hunnic invasions, which would contribute to the fall of the Western Roman Empire, drove home once again the power of the composite bow in the hands of skilled mounted archers. Germanic peoples and other European groups learned, often painfully, that traditional heavy infantry tactics were ineffective against enemies who could strike from beyond reach and disappear before a counterattack could be mounted. The legacy of the Scythian composite bow extended far beyond Europe. The design influenced bow-making throughout Asia. The Parthians adopted it. The Sarmatians, who displaced the Scythians in the Pontic steppe, used bows that evolved from Scythian designs. The Mongols, whose conquests would reshape the medieval world, employed composite bows that were direct descendants of the Scythian tradition. The Turkish bow, arguably the pinnacle of composite bow development, refined the Scythian design to produce weapons capable of shooting arrows over 800 meters. The influence reached as far as Korea and Japan, where composite bow traditions developed that showed clear connections to the ancient steppe designs. Even India and the Middle East, which had their own composite bow traditions predating the Scythians, were influenced by the Scythian innovations in mounted archery tactics. In a very real sense, the composite bow, as refined and deployed by the Scythians, remained the dominant range weapon system across most of Eurasia for nearly 2,000 years, from the 7th century BC until the widespread adoption of firearms in the early modern period. No other pre-gunpowder weapon system achieved such geographic spread or such enduring military relevance. The English longbow, often celebrated in European military history, was dominant for perhaps 300 years, and only in Western Europe. The composite bow, in its various forms, was used from Japan to Hungary, from southern Siberia to Arabia, across a span of 2 millennia. The technology itself represented one of humanity's most sophisticated pre-modern material achievements. The composite bow required understanding of multiple materials and their properties, of stress and tension and energy storage, of organic chemistry through the preparation and use of animal glues. It demanded craftsmanship of the highest order, patience measured in months or years, and the ability to work with living materials that varied in quality and required individual adjustment. A master bowyer needed to understand wood grain, the properties of different types of horn, the treatment of sinew, the mixing of glues, the effects of temperature and humidity on materials. This was empirical materials science, developed without benefit of modern analytical tools, passed down through generations of accumulated experience and observation. The composite bow also represented a complete military system, not just a weapon. It required the guritos to protect and carry it. It required specialized arrows carefully balanced and fletched, with arrowheads designed for specific purposes, some for penetrating armor, others for causing bleeding wounds, still others for long-range shooting. It required horses trained for archery, accustomed to the sound and movement of the bow, trained to respond to leg commands while the rider's hands were occupied. It required a lifetime of training for the archer, building the strength to draw heavy bows repeatedly, developing the technique to shoot accurately while moving, learning to judge range and wind and the movement of targets. It required a complete cultural system that valued mobility over static defense, ranged combat over personal glory in close combat, patience and harassment over decisive battle. The Scythians brought all of this to Europe. They brought the weapon, the technology to make it, the tactics to employ it, and the terror that made it legendary. European peoples witnessed what a truly sophisticated ranged weapon system could accomplish. They saw traditional warfare made obsolete by technological superiority. They experienced the helplessness of being outranged, outmaneuvered, unable to respond effectively to an enemy who controlled the terms of engagement. These were lessons that would echo through military history, recurring whenever technological advantage met technological inferiority, whenever mobility confronted static defense, whenever innovation challenged tradition. The Scythians themselves eventually faded from history. By the 3rd century BC, they were being displaced by the Sarmatians, another Iranian-speaking nomadic people from the east. By the 2nd century AD, the last Scythian remnants were being absorbed by the Goths and other migrating peoples during the great population movements of the migration period. The name Scythian became, in later classical and medieval usage, a generic term for any barbarous people from the north, losing its specific ethnic meaning. But the composite bow they brought to Europe, the tactics they pioneered, and the military lessons they taught endured. The recurve profile, the composite construction of hornwood and sinew, the integration of mounted archery into military doctrine, all of these would be rediscovered, refined, and re-employed by successive waves of steppe peoples entering Europe. In the 21st century, the composite bow lives on in modern archery. The recurve bow used in Olympic archery is a direct descendant of the Scythian design, though now built with fiberglass and carbon fiber rather than horn and sinew. The fundamental principles remain identical: maximize energy storage in a short bow through recurve geometry and composite construction. Traditional bowyers still craft composite bows using ancient techniques, and modern experimental archaeology has validated the performance characteristics recorded in ancient sources. Replica Scythian bows with draw weights exceeding 45 kilograms have been built and tested. They achieve the ranges ancient sources describe. They penetrate period-appropriate armour. The ancient sources, it turns out, were not exaggerating. The story of the composite bow's arrival in Europe is ultimately a story about technological revolution and its consequences. A single innovation, carried by a mobile warrior culture from the steppes of Asia, fundamentally challenged European military traditions that had existed for centuries. It forced adaptations in tactics, equipment, and strategic thinking. It demonstrated that military superiority came not just from courage or numbers, but from technological edge and innovative application. It showed that settled civilizations, for all their wealth and population, could be vulnerable to smaller groups with superior mobility and better weapons. These lessons were hard-learned and often painful. The Persians discovered them when Darius's vast army retreated from Scythia, having accomplished nothing. The Greeks learned them facing Persian mounted archers at Plataea. The Romans learned them at Carrhae, where the composite bow-wielding Parthians destroyed 7 legions. The late Romans and early medieval Europeans would relearn them facing the Huns, the Avars, and eventually the Mongols. Each time, the same pattern repeated. Conventional armies built around heavy infantry found themselves helpless against mobile mounted archers who could kill from beyond reach and disappear before retaliation. The composite bow was not invincible, of course. Alexander defeated the Sarka, though at heavy cost. The Romans eventually developed tactics to counter Parthian mounted archers. The Mongols, the ultimate expression of steppe-mounted archery, were eventually stopped and driven back. But these victories came at tremendous cost and required careful adaptation of tactics and technology. They required combined arms approaches, using light infantry and cavalry to screen heavy troops, developing better armour to resist arrows, creating fortifications and tactical positions that limited the enemy's mobility. They required, in essence, understanding and respecting the power of the technological advantage the composite bow provided. 750 years before Christ, when the first Scythian riders appeared on the steppes of Eastern Europe, carrying bows short enough to use from horseback but powerful enough to kill at 500 meters, they brought more than a weapon. They brought a transformation in how warfare was conducted. They brought proof that technology and mobility could overcome traditional military strength. They brought terror and devastation, but also, ultimately, innovation and adaptation. The composite bow changed European warfare not just by being present, but by forcing Europeans to think differently about combat, about range and mobility, about the integration of technology into military systems. The echo of Scythian arrows loosed from composite bows can be heard throughout military history. From the Hunnic invasions that helped topple Rome, through the medieval encounters with Hungarian and Turkish horse archers, to the Mongol conquests that reshaped Eurasia, the descendants of that original Scythian innovation continued to shape European and Asian warfare. Even after firearms made the composite bow obsolete as a military weapon, the memory of what it had accomplished endured. The composite bow remained, in historical memory, the weapon that gave the nomads of the steppes their terrible power, the technological edge that allowed small groups of mobile horsemen to terrorize and sometimes conquer great empires. Today, archaeologists continue to uncover Scythian burial mounds, revealing more about these mysterious people who brought the composite bow to Europe. Museum collections preserve Scythian bows, some remarkably well preserved in the frozen tombs of the Altai Mountains. Modern craftsmen recreate these ancient weapons, testing ancient techniques, validating ancient claims. And modern military historians study Scythian tactics, recognizing in them the essential principles of mobile warfare, of using technological superiority to dictate the terms of engagement, of refusing battle except when conditions favor the technologically advanced force. The specific technology has changed, from composite bows to machine guns to guided missiles, but the underlying principles the Scythians pioneered remained fundamental to military thinking. When the composite bow first reached Europe in the hands of the Scythians, it marked one of those pivotal moments when technology reshapes history. It demonstrated that innovation could come from unexpected places, that supposed barbarians could possess technologies superior to those of settled civilizations, that military dominance was not permanent, but could be overturned by those with better tools and better tactics. It showed that adaptation was essential for survival, that armies and cultures unable or unwilling to learn from their enemies were doomed to defeat. These lessons, learned painfully by European peoples encountering the Scythian composite bow, have remained relevant throughout history and remain relevant still. Technology matters, mobility matters, the ability to strike at range while remaining out of reach matters. The Scythians brought these lessons to Europe 2,700 years ago, written in the trajectory of arrows loosed from composite bows, and Europe slowly and painfully learned them. The transformation of European military thinking in response to the composite bow was neither immediate nor uniform. Different regions and cultures adapted at different speeds, influenced by geography, existing military traditions, and the frequency of contact with steppe peoples. The Greek city-states, positioned at the crossroads between Europe and Asia, through their Black Sea colonies, were among the first to truly grapple with the implications of Scythian archery technology. By the 6th century BC, Greek military theorists were already writing about the challenges posed by mounted archers, and Greek armies were beginning to incorporate archery units into their traditionally hoplite-dominated forces. The Greek response to the composite bow threat reveals much about how military innovation spreads through contact and necessity. Initially, Greek commanders simply hired Scythian mercenaries. Why attempt to replicate a technology and train your own men in unfamiliar techniques when you could simply pay experts to fight for you? Athenian records from the 5th century BC document regular payments to Scythian archers serving in the city's military and police forces. These weren't just a handful of specialists. Athens maintained a standing force of roughly 300 Scythian archers, a significant investment for a city-state that prided itself on its citizen soldiers. These mercenaries brought their own equipment, including their precious composite bows, carefully maintained and protected in their characteristic goritoi. But reliance on mercenaries had obvious limitations. Mercenaries could be expensive, unreliable, or simply unavailable when needed most. More fundamentally, dependence on foreign troops for a critical military capability was strategically vulnerable. Greek craftsmen began attempting to produce composite bows domestically, with mixed results. The climate of Greece, while not as wet as northern Europe, was still more humid than the Central Asian steppes where the composite bow had been perfected. Greek-made composite bows worked, but they required constant maintenance and were prone to delamination if not properly cared for. Moreover, the materials were expensive and often had to be imported. Horns suitable for bow-making came from ibex and wild goats in mountainous regions, or had to be traded from the Black Sea area. High-quality sinew required processing techniques that Greek craftsmen had to learn from scratch. The training problem was even more significant. Scythian children grew up with bows in their hands, learning to shoot before they could read, if they learned to read at all. They spent their lives on horseback, developing the balance and coordination necessary to shoot accurately while moving. Greek attempts to create their own mounted archery corps faced the reality that neither the skills nor the cultural infrastructure existed to support this kind of warfare. Horsemanship in Greek city-states was primarily an aristocratic pursuit, and even wealthy Greeks typically rode for transportation or pleasure, not for military purposes. The idea of spending years learning to shoot a bow while riding would have seemed absurd to a Greek hoplite who measured his worth by his prowess with spear and shield in the phalanx. The Macedonians under Philip II and Alexander the Great took a different approach. Rather than trying to turn Macedonians into steppe horse archers, they developed combined arms tactics that could counter mounted archery while playing to Macedonian strengths. The Macedonian phalanx with its long sarissa pikes could present a bristling wall of spear points that made cavalry charges suicidal. Macedonian cavalry, the famous companion cavalry, was trained for shock action, smashing into enemy formations rather than skirmishing at range. To deal with enemy archers, including those using composite bows, the Macedonians employed light infantry, javelin men and slingers who could screen the heavy troops and counter-skirmish against mounted archers. This combined arms approach represented a sophisticated understanding of how to fight enemies with technological advantages in specific areas. You didn't need to match them weapon for weapon if you could create tactical situations where their advantages were neutralized and your strengths were decisive. When Alexander faced the Saka horse archers at the Jaxarta River, he used light infantry to fix them in place, while his cavalry maneuvered to cut off their retreat. He used artillery, torsion catapults, that could outrange even composite bows to drive the horse archers away from the river crossing. He combined different troop types, each with their own capabilities, to create a tactical system greater than the sum of its parts. Yet even Alexander recognized the fundamental power of the composite bow. After conquering the Persian Empire, he incorporated Persian and Central Asian horse archers into his army, units that came equipped with their own composite bows and traditional tactics. The Macedonian military system became a hybrid, combining Macedonian heavy infantry and cavalry with Eastern horse archers and light troops. This hybridization would characterize successor kingdoms after Alexander's death. The Seleucid Empire maintained large contingents of horse archers recruited from the Iranian plateau and Central Asia. The Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt employed mercenary horse archers from various sources. These successor states understood that composite bow-armed cavalry filled a crucial role that their traditional troops could not. The Romans approached the problem differently again. Roman military culture valued discipline, unit cohesion, and the ability to execute complex maneuvers in formation. The legionary with his pilum, gladius, and scutum was the centerpiece of Roman military doctrine. Archery was traditionally relegated to auxiliary units, non-Roman troops recruited from subject peoples. But as Rome expanded eastward and encountered the Parthians, the limitations of this approach became catastrophically clear. The Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC was a watershed moment in Roman military history. Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest and most powerful men, led 7 legions, roughly 40,000 men, into Parthia seeking glory and gold. He met Surena, a Parthian general, commanding roughly 10,000 cavalry, most of them horse archers equipped with powerful composite bows. The battle was a masterclass in how mobility and ranged weapons could destroy a seemingly superior force. The Roman legions formed their traditional close-order formations, shields locked, prepared to receive the Parthian charge. But the Parthians didn't charge. They circled the Romans at a distance of about 150 meters, just beyond effective pilum range, and began shooting. Parthian composite bows, drawing up to 70 kilograms, launched arrows that punched through Roman shields and armor. The arrows came in clouds, thousands of them, a continuous rain of death that the Romans could not answer. When Roman cohorts tried to charge and close the distance, Parthian horse archers simply wheeled away, maintaining their distance, continuing to shoot. When the Romans tried to form testudo, the famous tortoise formation with shields overhead, the Parthians used heavier bows to shoot through the shield roof or targeted the exposed legs. The Romans discovered that Surena had brought a camel train loaded with hundreds of thousands of arrows. The Parthians were not going to run out of ammunition. Hour after hour the arrows fell. Roman soldiers, weighed down by heavy armor and equipment, exhausted in the Mesopotamian heat, unable to reach an enemy who refused to close, watched their comrades fall in steadily mounting numbers. When Crassus sent his son Publius with cavalry to drive off the Parthian horse archers, Surena concentrated his forces and destroyed the Roman cavalry detachment. Publius's head was brought back and displayed to the demoralized Roman army. By the end of the day, 20,000 Romans were dead, 10,000 captured, and only 10,000 escaped. Crassus himself was killed during negotiations, his death surrounded by such confusion that no one could agree on exactly what happened. His head and hand were cut off and brought to the Parthian king, who allegedly poured molten gold into the mouth, mocking Crassus's legendary greed. Carrhae traumatized Rome. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history, comparable to Cannae or the Teutoburg Forest. But more than the loss of life, Carrhae revealed that Roman military supremacy was not universal. There were enemies against whom traditional Roman tactics simply did not work, enemies whose technology and tactics could destroy legions with relative ease. The Senate launched inquiries. Military theorists wrote treatises on how to fight mounted archers. The Romans began, slowly and reluctantly, to adapt. auxiliary archer units were expanded and given more prominence in campaign planning. Roman commanders learned to avoid fighting in open terrain against horse archers, seeking instead broken ground where cavalry maneuverability was limited. Roman armies in the east began incorporating more cavalry and developing their own mounted archer units, recruited primarily from Syrian and other eastern provinces, where archery traditions were strong. But Rome never fully solved the Parthian problem. Subsequent campaigns against Parthia and its successor state, the Sasanian Persian Empire, were at best mixed successes. Marcus Aurelius fought inconclusive wars against the Parthians. Septimius Severus achieved temporary victories but could not hold territory. The fundamental problem remained. Parthian military power was based on a technology and tactical system that Romans found difficult to counter and even more difficult to replicate. The composite bow and the horse archer tradition were so deeply embedded in Parthian and Persian culture that they could field tens of thousands of skilled mounted archers, while Rome struggled to train and equip even a few thousand. The later Roman Empire, particularly the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire, took the lessons of Carrhae to heart. Byzantine military manuals from the 6th and 7th centuries AD devote extensive attention to mounted archery and the use of composite bows. The Strategicon, attributed to Emperor Maurice and dating to around 600 AD, describes in detail the equipment and tactics of Byzantine cavalry archers. The Byzantines had recognized that to survive in a world surrounded by enemies who used composite bows and mounted archery, they needed to adopt these technologies themselves, regardless of how foreign they were to traditional Roman military culture. Byzantine horse archers, the cavallarioi, were equipped with composite bows described as Hunnic or Persian in style. Substantial weapons with draw weights of 40 to 50 kilograms. They wore armour, carried swords and lances in addition to their bows, and were trained to fight both as archers and as shock cavalry. This represented a complete military revolution from the days when Rome relied primarily on heavy infantry. The Byzantine adoption of the composite bow and mounted archery was pragmatic and thorough. The government sponsored bow-making workshops, importing craftsmen who knew the traditional construction techniques. Materials were stockpiled, horn and sinew purchased from across the empire and beyond. Training programs were established to teach soldiers not just archery, but the specific techniques needed for mounted archery, shooting while moving, the various positions and grips, care and maintenance of the sensitive composite bow. Byzantine emperors personally practiced archery, understanding that in their world, military effectiveness required mastery of this Eastern technology. The results spoke for themselves. Byzantine armies successfully held off Persians, Avars, Arabs, and eventually Turks for centuries, in large part because they could fight these enemies on equal technological terms. The arrival of the Huns in Europe during the late 4th century AD represented another wave of composite bow technology, this time bringing innovations that had developed on the steppes during the centuries since the Scythian migrations. Hunnic bows were longer than early Scythian designs, typically 140 to 160 centimetres when strung, and featured stiffened grips and pronounced ears, the curved sections near the tips, created by adding rigid bone or antler laths. These design refinements increased the bow's efficiency and power. Hunnic arrows were shorter and lighter than their Scythian predecessors, optimized for flat trajectory and high velocity rather than maximum range. The result was a weapon that could penetrate armour more effectively while maintaining accuracy. The Huns brought more than just improved bows. They brought a military system honed by centuries of warfare on the steppes, a system where every man was a mounted archer from childhood, where mobility was absolute, and where the ability to shoot accurately while moving at full gallop was simply expected. Hun tactics terrified European peoples who had grown accustomed to more predictable forms of warfare. Hunnic armies appeared seemingly out of nowhere, struck with devastating speed, and vanished before effective response was possible. They used feigned retreats to draw enemies into ambushes. They coordinated complex maneuvers across wide fronts using horn signals and banners. They demonstrated again what the Scythians had shown 1,000 years earlier, that mobility and firepower, properly combined, could defeat larger and seemingly more powerful enemies. The Hunnic invasions set off a cascade of population movements across Europe, the Great Migration period that would transform the ethnic and political map of the continent. Germanic tribes, pressed by Hunnic expansion, moved westward and southward into Roman territory. The The Goths, Vandals, Burgundians, Franks, and others who had established the medieval kingdoms of Europe were all, to varying degrees, fleeing or displaced by the pressure of Hunnic military power. That power was based fundamentally on the composite bow and the mobile horse archer tradition. In a very real sense, the composite bow reshaped not just military history, but the entire demographic and political structure of medieval Europe. The Germanic peoples who carved kingdoms from Roman territory had complex relationships with horse archery technology. Some, like the Goths, had extensive contact with steppe peoples and adopted elements of horse archer tactics and equipment. Archaeological evidence from Gothic sites includes composite bow fragments and Hunnic-style arrowheads. But most Germanic military tradition remained focused on infantry combat with spears, swords, and axes, and cavalry used primarily for shock action rather than archery. The composite bow remained somewhat foreign to Germanic military culture, associated with the hated Huns and other steppe peoples. When Germanic warriors did use bows, they were more likely to use simple self bows of wood, weapons that fit better with their material culture and available resources. This cultural resistance to adopting the composite bow, even when its military advantages were clear, reveals important truths about technological diffusion. Technology doesn't spread simply because it's superior. It spreads when it fits with existing cultural practices, when the resources to produce and maintain it are available, when the social structures exist to support its use, and when the people using it value the capabilities it provides. For steppe nomads, the composite bow fit perfectly with a lifestyle centered on herding, mobility, and mounted warfare. For settled agricultural peoples of Europe, the composite bow required resources, skills, and military doctrines that were foreign to their traditions. The result was that even after 1,000 years of contact with composite bow-using peoples, most of Western Europe still relied primarily on simple bows or crossbows, weapons that were less powerful but more practical, given European conditions and military culture. The Arabs, bursting out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century AD, brought yet another wave of composite bow technology to the Mediterranean world. Arab archery had ancient roots, but it was refined and systematized during the early Islamic conquests. The Arab composite bow, similar in construction to Persian and Byzantine designs, but with distinct characteristics in its proportions and recurve, became a symbol of Islamic military power. Arab archery manuals, beginning with works written in the 9th and 10th centuries, preserved detailed technical knowledge about bow construction, arrow making, and shooting techniques. These texts, written by master archers for students, provide extraordinary insight into the complexity of composite bow technology. One such manual, the Book of Archery and the Noble Attributes of Arms, written by Abu Ismail al-Isfahani in the 10th century, describes in minute detail the selection of materials, the preparation of glue from fish bladders, the shaping and layering of horn and sinew, the heating and cooling cycles needed during construction, and the various decorative and protective treatments applied to finished bows. The level of technical knowledge preserved in these texts is remarkable, representing centuries of accumulated practical experience transformed into written instruction. These manuals demonstrate that composite bow making was understood as a sophisticated craft requiring years of apprenticeship and deep understanding of materials. Arab archery also developed as a sport and art form, not just a military necessity. Archery competitions were held regularly, with detailed rules and carefully measured ranges. Mamluk sultans in Egypt, themselves often trained as horse archers before rising to power, sponsored archery and maintained training grounds where military efficiency was maintained through constant practice. The famous Mamluk horse archers, who defeated the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, represented perhaps the pinnacle of composite bow military effectiveness. These were professional soldiers, trained from childhood as slaves purchased specifically for military service, who spent their entire lives perfecting the arts of horsemanship and archery. When Mamluk cavalry faced Mongol cavalry, both sides using composite bows and mounted archery tactics, the result was determined not by technological advantage, but by training, discipline, and tactical execution. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century demonstrated once more the terrible effectiveness of composite bow warfare at its most refined. Mongol bows, descendants of the ancient Scythian tradition, but refined by centuries of development, were shorter than Hunnic designs, typically about 120 to 130 centimeters, optimized for use from horseback. They were extremely powerful, with draw weights often exceeding 60 kilograms for military bows. Mongol arrows were carefully standardized, with whistling arrows used for signaling, armor-piercing arrows for heavy targets, and lighter arrows for maximum range and rate of fire. But the Mongol military system was more than just good equipment. It was total integration of technology, tactics, training, and logistics. Every Mongol warrior was a mounted archer. Every warrior owned multiple horses, allowing Mongol armies to move with unprecedented speed. Mongol units could coordinate complex maneuvers across vast distances using signal arrows and courier systems. They practiced combined arms warfare, using light cavalry for harassment and reconnaissance, heavy cavalry for shock action, and siege weapons for reducing fortifications. At the heart of everything was the composite bow, and the ability to use it from horseback with devastating accuracy. European armies facing the Mongols discovered that 1,000 years of sporadic contact with horse archer peoples had not prepared them for opponents who had perfected the art to this degree. At the Battle of Liegnitz in 1241, a combined Polish-German army was destroyed by Mongol forces that used their standard tactics: feigned retreat drawing the Europeans into disorganized pursuit, then sudden counterattack with fresh troops, while mounted archers enveloped and annihilated the scattered enemy. At the Battle of Mohi, also in 1241, the Hungarian army, despite outnumbering the Mongols, was crushed when Mongol horse archers fixed the Hungarians in place with archery, while other units forded rivers and attacked from unexpected directions. European heavy cavalry, which had dominated Western European warfare for centuries, proved almost useless against enemies who simply refused to engage in close combat. The Mongol withdrawal from Europe after the death of Ogedei Khan in 1242 spared Western Europe from the fate of Russia, the Middle East and China, but the brief Mongol presence left an indelible impression. European military theorists recognized that traditional Western tactics were inadequate against sophisticated horse archer armies. Some regions adapted more successfully than others. The Hungarians, who had suffered devastating Mongol invasions, systematically studied Mongol tactics and adopted elements of horse archery, recruiting steppe peoples into their armies and learning to use composite bows. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Hungarian horse archers were renowned throughout Europe, mercenaries sought after by various kingdoms for their skills. The Turks represented the final, and in many ways most successful transmission of composite bow technology into Europe. The Ottoman Turks, emerging from Central Asian roots and conquering Anatolia and eventually the Balkans, brought with them a bow-making tradition that had evolved continuously from ancient steppe origins. The Turkish composite bow, particularly in its mature form, developed during the 15th and 16th centuries, represented the absolute pinnacle of the technology. Turkish bows were relatively short, around 100 to 120 centimeters, but extraordinarily powerful. Flight bows, specialized designs for shooting maximum distance, rather than military use, could launch light, arrows over 800 meters, nearly half a mile. Military bows, heavier and designed for penetrating power, could still shoot well over 400 meters with arrows capable of piercing plate armor at closer ranges. Turkish bow making became a specialized art, with master bowyers whose names were recorded and whose work was prized throughout the Islamic world and beyond. The Istanbul Bowmakers Guild maintained strict standards and training requirements. A master bowyer's mark on a bow guaranteed quality and became a point of pride. The Ottomans maintained state arsenals where bows were manufactured for military use, but the finest bows were still made by individual craftsmen using techniques that had been refined over generations. These bows were constructed using water buffalo horn for the belly, sourced primarily from the Balkans, sinew from cattle or horses, and maple wood for the core. The glue was made from fish bladders or animal hide, prepared according to specific recipes that were closely guarded secrets. Ottoman military doctrine placed enormous emphasis on archery training. Young men recruited into the Janissary Corps, the elite Ottoman infantry, spent years learning archery as part of their military education. Accuracy and speed were both valued. A skilled Ottoman archer could loose 12 to 15 arrows per minute, maintaining this rate for extended periods. Turkish military archery competitions held to maintain military skills recorded extraordinary feats. The Ok Meydani, the archery field in Istanbul, contains marble pillars marking the longest shots achieved by various archers, with distances exceeding 700 meters for the very best. These were not myths or exaggerations. Modern reconstructions of Turkish flight bows, built using traditional materials and methods, have achieved ranges exceeding 700 meters under controlled conditions. The Ottoman conquests brought composite bow warfare into the heart of Europe. At the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, Ottoman forces destroyed a Crusader army despite being outnumbered. Ottoman archers, both mounted and on foot, rained arrows on French knights who charged, expecting to crush the Turkish light cavalry. Instead, the knights found themselves bogged down fighting Turkish infantry while Ottoman Sipahi cavalry, the backbone of Ottoman military power, flanked and encircled them. At the Battle of Varna in 1444, Ottoman composite bow fire broke Polish-Hungarian charges before they could reach the Ottoman lines. At the Siege of Constantinople in 1453, Ottoman archers provided covering fire for siege operations, suppressing Byzantine defenders while Ottoman cannon battered the ancient walls. But by the 15th century, the age of the composite bow was beginning to wane, not because of any decline in the technology itself, but because gunpowder weapons were becoming increasingly effective. Firearms had several advantages over bows, even composite bows. They required far less training to use effectively. A man could be taught to shoot a musket adequately in weeks, while it took years to develop a skilled archer. Firearms were less affected by weather, didn't require rare materials or specialized craftsmen, and penetrated armor more reliably than arrows. The psychological impact of firearms, the noise and smoke and the wounds they caused, also played a role in their adoption. The transition was gradual, not sudden. Through the 16th century, bows and firearms served alongside each other in many armies. The Ottomans maintained large archery corps into the 17th century. The Persians under the Safavid dynasty continued to value horse archers. The Mughals in India employed composite bow-armed cavalry well into the 18th century. But the trend was clear. By 1700, firearms had replaced bows in most European armies. By 1800, even in regions where the composite bow had dominated for millennia, guns had taken over as primary military weapons. The composite bow that the Scythians brought to Europe in the 8th century BC had enjoyed a remarkable run, nearly 2.5 millennia, as one of history's most effective weapons. No other pre-gunpowder military technology achieved such geographic spread, such longevity, or such consistent effectiveness across so many different cultures and conflicts. From the steppes of Central Asia to the fields of Hungary, from the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of Anatolia, the composite bow shaped warfare and through warfare shaped history. Empires rose and fell based on their ability to field effective archers. Battles were won and lost based on the effective range and penetrating power of composite bows versus the armour and tactics of their opponents. Military innovations and counter-innovations revolved around either maximising the effectiveness of composite bow-armed troops or finding ways to negate their advantages. The story of the composite bow in Europe is ultimately a story about how technology moves between cultures, how innovation spreads, and why some technologies are adopted while others are not. The composite bow was clearly superior in many ways to the simple self-bows used in Europe before the Scythian arrival. Yet it never completely replaced those simpler weapons in most of Western Europe, even after more than 2,000 years of contact. The reasons were complex: climate, available materials, manufacturing difficulty, training requirements, existing military traditions and cultural values all played roles. Technology adoption is never just about technical superiority. It's about fit with existing systems, practical feasibility, cultural acceptance, and whether the benefits justify the costs. The composite bow also demonstrates how military technology can drive broader historical changes. The Scythian invasions, enabled by composite bow-armed mobile warfare, set off chain reactions that reshaped Eastern Europe. The Hunnic invasions, similarly, triggered the migration period that ended the Western Roman Empire and created medieval Europe. The Mongol invasions, bringing composite bow warfare to its peak, destroyed kingdoms, redirected trade routes, and changed the political map from China to Poland. The Ottoman conquests, with composite bow-armed Sipahis as a crucial military element, brought Islam into Europe and created a geopolitical situation that would shape European history into the modern era. In each case, a weapon technology was not just a tool, but a driver of historical change. Today, the composite bow exists primarily as a historical artifact and a sporting implement. Museums around the world preserve Scythian, Persian, Turkish, and Mongol composite bows, allowing us to study their construction and appreciate their craftsmanship. Traditional bowyers continue to make composite bows using ancient techniques, keeping alive knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Experimental archaeologists test replica bows, validating ancient accounts and understanding the actual capabilities of these weapons. Archers practice traditional shooting techniques, maintaining links to ancient warrior traditions. The composite bow, though no longer a weapon of war, remains a testament to human ingenuity, to the sophistication possible in pre-modern technology, and to the profound impact that a single innovation can have when it meets the right historical moment. When the Scythians rode into Eastern Europe 2,700 years ago carrying their compact, powerful composite bows, they brought more than a weapon. They brought a revolution in military affairs that would echo through millennia, influencing warfare across 3 continents, contributing to the rise and fall of empires, and fundamentally changing how humans fought one another. The bow itself, a masterpiece of materials science and craftsmanship, represented some of the most sophisticated technology of its era. But its impact came from how it was used, integrated into a complete military system that valued mobility, firepower, and the ability to strike without being struck. These principles, first demonstrated on European soil by Scythian horse archers, remain relevant to military thinking today, even though the technologies have changed beyond recognition. The composite bow changed warfare when it reached Europe, and through warfare it changed Europe itself.